Okay, we'll have some people kind of floating in as we get started, but I want to go ahead and get started this morning because we have a wonderful topic that we're going to be talking about. My name is Lisa Buck, and I'm filling in for Steve on who's at home resting from hip surgery. Um, who's not bored at all and who is doing great work at home. So I'm filling in. And so if Steve were here, if Steve Butt were here, he would introduce our guest today as he would go through, the fact that she went to Georgetown Law School and she worked as the assistant district attorney in Oklahoma County in the juvenile division. And then he would proudly say that she worked with him at the Office of Juvenile Affairs. And then the most proud papa would come out when he would say that she followed him and became his predecessor at OJA. And he's very proud of Rachel and the work that she has done. But since Steve Buck is not here, my introduction is I'm very proud to introduce my friend, Rachel Holt. Rachel is a passionate, fiery, focused individual that is keyed in on helping families and children. But she's also got the sweetest, most tender heart that I think pretty much any prosecutor has ever had that I've ever run across. She is very passionate about her kiddos and taking care of them. And she's also First Lady of Oklahoma City, which is just a side note to everything else great that Rachel does. So welcome, Rachel.
Oh, thank you, friend.
Yeah.
Yes. I think if Steve was here, he'd have some stories, which I think is better not to share at this time on a Sunday morning.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for the introduction.
Yeah, of course. Rachel was always my go-to at the mandatory events that we had to attend together, and I could always find the friend that was also not wanting to be at particular things at particular times, and we could always commiserate together. But let's talk a little bit about when you were in ADA. Talk about what that looks like a little bit. What you did as an ADA in juvenile, what kind of kids that you work with, families that you work with, what that looked like.
Sure. So I was an assistant district attorney in the Oklahoma County Juvenile Division, and in Oklahoma County, I don't know if you're aware of this, but we have the downtown court where all the criminal and civil and probably where you've gone for jury duty. And then we have a juvenile division, which is at 5905 North Classen. That is near the Chesapeake campus. There's a juvenile court there. There's a juvenile detention center there operated by the Juvenile Bureau of Oklahoma County. And there's some court that occurs there is for deprived, so DHS custody children, and then delinquent cases, so children that are in the juvenile justice system have been accused of or been adjudicated for committing crimes. So I started working there during law school at OU in 2006. And when I graduated in 2007, I came on as an assistant district attorney and stayed there for 3 years, had my son, George, took a couple years off to stay home and have my babies and raise babies, and came back part-time, was doing that for 2 years when met Steve Buck and moved to the Office of Juvenile Affairs Agency. Thank you. In the juvenile justice system, in Oklahoma County, there are 5 courtrooms, and every day is a full day of dockets and cases for those judges and prosecutors. From the deprived DHS custody cases, reviewing those cases and the status of those families, to the juvenile delinquent docket, checking on kids that are in detention, checking on the status of their cases or their probation plans. And I say this often as being a part of a state agency that operates in all 77 counties. In the state of Oklahoma, we have 77 counties, but we do juvenile justice 100 different ways. And that's because in the courtroom, and you've been in courtrooms, Especially in juvenile division, there are so many different players. There's the judge, there's the district attorney, there's the public defender or defense attorney or child's attorney. There is either the DHS worker, the OJ worker, the juvenile bureau probation officer. And then, of course, there are the children and the families that have cases with us. But in Oklahoma County, there's 5 judges, and there's some differences amongst those judges, just as there are in all 77 counties. When I was a young prosecutor, I have said this recently pretty often, that in my position today, leading a state agency of 450 employees, I most days do not feel as powerful as I thought I was as a 26-year-old ADA in Judge Stewart's courtroom in Oklahoma County. I really thought I knew everything and had all the power in the world, and so I've been humbled every day in that. But what you see in the families that come to the courtroom, even in Oklahoma County, which you think is probably has more economic advantages than these rural counties across the state, is you see families that have generational poverty, generational abuse, substance abuse, untreated mental health, and you see it from generations. You see the grandmother that's trying to get custody of the children, you see the parents, you see the children. And many of the children that are on the juvenile justice side either have had some kind of contact in the DHS side or should have some kind of contact in the DHS side, so the cases kind of blend together. In my experience in juvenile court, it's done best when all of those players that are in the courtroom are working together. Because, in adult court, you say, oh, okay, you pled guilty to this, you're going to go to DOC for this amount of time. Except for, of course, there are wonderful and growing treatment courts now that are great. But in the juvenile system, we're really trying to change families. We're really trying to change the future of kids. And so I learned a lot every day. I was humbled every day in those moments. I remember I had a kid on probation and, saying, you were supposed to go to school and you're not going to school. And he looked at me and said, I'm a 16-year-old Hispanic male. I have to work every day. I have to provide for my family. And I was just humbled in that moment because that's different than me and learning that. And I see that every day when I talk to our kids in OJ custody and probation and hear their stories and learn how different their life is than the life I have and the life of my 2 kids at home. And so it's just appreciating and understanding the families and everyone's journey to get there. There's similarities, but everyone is unique, and trying to wrap your arms around those families as a team and get them through the system and into success.
I think you made a couple of really good points. I always tell everybody, everybody should spend one day in family court. You should. When we fostered, I would take my teenage daughters and make them sit through family court with us. You see the rawest of humanity, and you see what broken looks like, and it's an experience like none other. You can go in Oklahoma County, I don't know if it's still the same way, but in Oklahoma County they had church pews sitting out in the hallways, and that's where you would have to wait to be called in. And you can just sit on the church pews and see everything and hear everything. And it's just a raw, powerful thing that you think, I have no idea. I just have no idea. And I think you also made a really good point too, and this is, I'm sure, what you run across in your daily work now. I went into my DHS work and thought that we had laws, right? And that everybody knew those laws, and we all followed those same laws, right? Isn't that what you think? Everybody's got the laws, and that there might be little tweaks or a little bit. It's kind of like the Bible. We interpret things a little bit differently here and there, but it's the law. No. There's as many different interpretations of that law as there are judges in this state, and the judges do whatever they want to do in their courtroom. It's a whole different thing. And so whereas you might be in a courtroom with one kiddo and this decision be made, you can have a very similar situation next door and a whole different outcome. happens. And so that's really tricky to work, especially in your type of work and with your workers and stuff that are on there on the dockets. You know, one of the terms that we really use a lot in social services is at risk. We have at risk families, at risk youth, and it's just a very common term that we use in social services. Tell me what at risk kids and at risk families look like in your world.
Right. There's the generalization, right? So poverty is kind of the number one thing, and then untreated mental health, substance abuse, just generational trauma, high adverse child experiences for my children, and then also for their parents and their parents before them. I think an at-risk kid is a kid that hasn't felt enough love and support in their life, whether that comes from within their family, whether that comes from that special teacher, whether that comes from that caring adult at church, or that coach, or that next door neighbor that just asks how they're doing. I think all kids are at risk because they've got that brain that's not fully developed until 26. They've got just a bunch of emotions, and if they're asked to make a decision, they will always make the worst one. Even if you counseled them through making better ones, they will forever choose the worst one. And so I think all kids are at risk, and I think the thing that keeps kids either sorted to the right way or continuing down that path is where is their support? What is their support? Even if they're born into a family of chaos, if they have that teacher they get to see every day, that coach they get to see, that neighbor that asks them every day how their day is, then that is something that can keep them away from that risk.
So coming off of our discussion points that we were supposed to stay on, I know Steve Buck is on the couch squirming right now. Uh, so coming off of that, let's talk about that just a minute, because I think that those of us that have teenagers, we realize that they do a lot of knuckleheaded things, right? I mean, they're just knuckleheads in some of their decision making processes and everything. But I think you hit on a really good point in that we really have to look at the whole child, and we have to realize that that frontal lobe is way more critical than we realized when we were growing up, and it's something that we're continuing to learn about. But that frontal lobe controls the decision-making processes, correct?
Yes, absolutely. I was visiting with a boy a couple weeks ago at our highest level facility, Central Oklahoma Juvenile Center in Tecumseh, and that's the one facility that the Office of Juvenile Affairs operates. It's the highest level. It's the perimeter fence. Thanks to Steve Buck, we got this bond issue and have rebuilt beautiful cottages, residential cottages. And we're working on other phases, and so inside it looks great, but the kids inside, the 51 boys that are living there today, are the highest level offenders in the state with the highest risk. And I talked to one boy and I said, tell me your story, what's going on. And he said, well, my friend called me and said, let's rob a dispensary. And I said, that's the dumbest idea ever. If you can't rob a dispensary, they've got cameras, you'll be caught. You shouldn't do it. I'm not doing it. Goodbye. Hangs up the phone, and a couple hours later, this young man's mother calls him in tears and says from the hospital, Grandma is dying. How are we going to pay for the funeral? So at 16 years old, he robbed a dispensary to help his mother pay for grandmother's funeral, and now he's a resident of the Central Oklahoma Juvenile Center. He identified the thought process, identified that he had the correct thought process until his mother asked him to help the family, and he made the wrong decision. And he kind of had a laugh about it, but he understands what that bad decision meant for his life and for his future path. And so, yes, always make the wrong decision. When I visit the children, the boys at Kojak is what we call it, I'll get all the reports that they're having incidents, and I'll go and see them and say, how can we do better on this incident? They'll say, oh yeah, Miss Holt, I got it. Yep, you're right. Should have done that. Should have used that. Shouldn't have done that. Should have walked away. And then, when I come back and see them, I just walk in the door and go, they say, I know, you read the report. I know. I mean, they don't I really believe in all of the children in right now, there's about 1,200 kids across the state that are somehow touching OJA, either in just an initial referral or we're just helping the family get some counseling or some services, all the way up to probation and custody. About 400 in custody, about 158 in placements outside of their homes. And those kids, so the majority of the kids are not these high-level criminals, and the vast majority of those kids will not recidivate again. The part of their reasons for the criminal activity is that terrible frontal lobe and those terrible decisions and kind of the circumstances that they're in, and that impulse that, hey, I want to eat, hey, I want those cool sneakers he has, hey, I want that game system, so I'm going to go rob a dispensary to get that. It doesn't make a lot of sense, and we know as they get older, they'll stop making those terrible decisions.
I think that that's important because what we've seen in science too is that trauma affects the frontal lobe, and that impulse control gets shorter and shorter and shorter the more trauma that the child has experienced, because they get caught living in that fight, flight, or freeze mechanism. And so when you're caught in that for a period of time, then that shortens that impulse control. And so it's like see sneakers, get sneakers, need money, get money. You're trapped in that. And I think it's really good that we as a society are coming along with that, catching up with the science that we're learning about the brain, because it changes the approach. Again, this is a little bit off script. But when we're on that, I think it's really important because I think that there's been a big shift in care for these kiddos because we know this science. In the olden days, right, they would just serve their time, and that time would be we're gonna discipline the right out of them or the wrong out of them to make them right. And so it was boot campish and very heavy-handed discipline and stuff to these children. Let's talk about how you guys have changed that in the last few years.
I will talk about how I've changed it. In 2007, when I was the most powerful person in the world as a baby ADA, I used to ask for detention for everything. Oh, judge, he's smoking marijuana again. Judge, put him in detention, put him in detention. And I'd slam my hand on the bench and highlight all the times in green that he tested positive for marijuana, and all the times I demanded detention, and all the times my judge denied me, mainly because my judge didn't really like me. But I was just certain that kid needed detention. Since then, we've learned more, or we've learned about ACE scores and the adverse childhood experiences, and those top 10 that you think of mental illness and divorce and abuse in the home. There's more than that. And one night in juvenile detention contributes to a child's ACE score. So in 2007, I was demanding ACE scores for our kids, and now I can admit maybe Judge Stewart was correct in denying me. And so now, when I'm 15 years later, writing laws around detention, writing policies for our agencies, writing risk evaluations for risk screeners for kids to go into detention, we really need juvenile detention to be for kids that we have a real fear of, that they need to be there to protect themselves or to protect the community, not because they smoke marijuana, because if we put every kid that smoked marijuana in detention, well, there wouldn't be enough detention beds in the state, unfortunately. We also know that when we put low-level, low-risk kids with high-risk, high-level offenders, the low kids rise up to the high kids. The low kids don't influence those high kids back down. It is a rising to the top. And so just in the 15 years, 16 years I've been in juvenile justice, what we've learned around ACEs, what we learn works. Boot camp doesn't work. Scaring them straight doesn't work. Threatening jail, detention, life in prison doesn't work. Unfortunately, many of these kids you threaten them with life in prison or going to jail, and they're like, yeah, that's about right. That tracks. That's where I thought my future would be. So that's not a deterrent to them. But at the Office of Juvenile Affairs, starting under Steve Buck's leadership and hopefully continuing with me, because Steve, of course, came from Department of Mental Health, and we try to look at the whole kid. And the court system, the judges, the district attorney, their defense attorneys have decided this kid is guilty and adjudicated on this crime and therefore should do probation or do OJ custody. And then once they come to OJA, either on probation or custody, we're not there to punish them. We're there to figure out a plan of rehabilitation for them and their family, and to get their case successfully closed and have them have successful futures. So that's certainly how it's changed. The Office of Juvenile Affairs was created under a federal lawsuit because of the way that we were treating kids when we were part of this larger Department of Human Services, and we were created in 1995. And so we're kind of less than 30 years old, but we remain under the Human Services Cabinet, which I think is great for the state of Oklahoma, that the Juvenile Justice Agency is a human service agency. We are not with Department of Corrections.
I don't know if you had time, and I didn't have time to read it. I saw the headlines in today's paper, front page of the paper. It talks about the number of municipal, I don't know what you call it. What's the right word for it? Arrest or municipal interactions that school children are receiving nowadays. And I didn't get all into it, but I'm sure you live it every day. We're in Edmond, right? And we're in the most affluent county, I think, in the state as far as resources, and we're definitely the largest county in the state. A lot of times we get a little bit blind in this part of the city as to or we tend to think that's urban. That doesn't happen here in Edmond. Or if it does, it's not our kids, it's not in our neighborhood, right? Talk to me a little bit about what you guys see and experience in this part of the city, because as we're looking at how can we affect our neighbors, how can we change the trajectory for the kids around us and our people, and what are the needs out there for these at-risk kids? Talk to me about what's right here in our neighborhood.
Yeah, thanks. But I did read that article this morning, and I'm still processing it because I have some strong thoughts and feelings around it. So the article, please read it in the Oklahoman, is about takes a look at municipal courts, so not part of the state court system that I'm involved in, but how municipal courts, children, and they looked at Edmond and Yukon and Moore and Oklahoma City Public Schools and Tulsa too, and Lawton they asked as well. Kids that were getting fights and were having fights in schools or having marijuana or truancy, that were also getting charged with municipal tickets and going into municipal city level courts, being put on probation, having to pay fees and fines and do community service and all that, and kind of that literature doesn't support that and is this kind of a double dipping. And of course there is disparity in how it's being used against children of color. And does paying a kid that is being suspended from school for a fight, does him and his family having to go to court and paying $820 in fines, is that an effective approach to changing that, or should we be connecting them to counseling and services in lieu of just fining them? And so, yes. So I would say in the Office of Juvenile Affairs, we have contracts with 37 designated youth service agencies across the state that provide services in all 77 counties. And they are as dynamic and robust and different as the counties in Oklahoma are. And so the counseling, one of our centers in Edmond, goes into all of the Edmond schools and talks to all of, I think it's the 5th graders, and they do like a stress reduction with 5th graders, right? Like how to be mindful, how to take a breath, how to take a beat. And I love that, right? Because if you learn in 5th grade, I would love to learn how to just like control my emotions and just deregulate. And then, in 9th grade, when someone challenges you to a fight, if you know how to be calm and walk away, then you're not coming into the juvenile justice system. And then we have services across, Pivot in Oklahoma City is another one that a lot of people are familiar with. They're doing tiny homes. And so each youth service agency is dynamic and different, trying to adjust their community needs. But I think kids are best served in their communities, in services that can wrap around them and their family. We know that fines and fees and punishments of kids. 2 years ago, the state passed had legislation to kind of get rid of fees and fines on kids in the juvenile justice system. They still, of course, can pay restitution if that's necessary, and probation fees for juvenile bureaus. But the Office of Juvenile Affairs, we gave up any kind of fees or fines that would come to us in order for the families to keep that money in their family.
We had a connections group here back before you opened your new center that would go down to Kojak and serve the girls down there. Well, was it Kojak with the girls? No.
Mustang.
No, it was the girls behind when you had, in Norman, that's right. Yeah, and they would go down and they built raised gardens with them, and they raised their vegetables, and then they cooked their vegetables and stuff. It was really a sweet thing, and they still talk about that, the girls that they came across, and the girls that they just to develop connection with. It really wasn't about the vegetables, right? It was about creating the connection. We've spent a lot of time with the girls at Mustang at the group home there, and that's a lovely experience too. They do a really good job of like they have. They incorporate the girls into the city softball league, which is really great because they get to go play softball, right? But nobody's there to cheer for them. And so what ends up happening is the other team's fans cheer for those girls because they don't have anybody there. We would go and cook breakfast for them on Thanksgiving morning because nobody would come pick them up for the long Thanksgiving weekend. No, nobody. They'd have, I don't remember how many kids can stay there, but they were always full, and like maybe they'd have one that would go home. And so there are ways that we can connect to the kids in your services. We did a book drive one time because your library was really low and we got hundreds of books. But I think we need to keep those things on the forefront. Pivot does a really great job with tiny homes. That's a need too with your kids that are coming out. Because sometimes the last thing we want to do is send them back from whence they came if it's not safe for them to go back there. Or sometimes their families don't embrace them coming back for whatever reason. Can we talk a little bit about what happens to those kids when they come out and maybe what that need looks like as we evaluate, what we're going to do with land, what we're going to do, how we can serve those people. What are some needs that you're currently looking at?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So these are kids, right? Just starting off in life like all of your children will, but your children will have you to drop you off at college or help you move into that new apartment. That's one of the things that I've been lamenting for all my time in this program is we either put a kids on probation plan or our higher level offenders, we remove them from their home. The Office of Juvenile Affairs contracts for group homes. Lisa mentioned Mustang, and those are 10 centers across the state that have up to 16 kids that are typically there about 5 to 7 months, and then they're supposed to return home back to the place from where they came. And then our Central Oklahoma Juvenile Center, which right now only houses boys, those boys will be there anywhere from 9 to 13, 14 months. They work, a program and gain levels at their own pace. So it's really up to them how fast that program is. But we put all of this time and effort and change, and these kids are getting 6 months and even 1 year older, and the difference that makes, both physically, seeing, I mean, these boys come in and I meet them and then they leave and they have like or trying to grow mustaches, and they've gotten taller and they're a year older, which is huge in teenage growth, kind of like dog years or something, I think. But then we send them back to the house that they came from, to the street that they came from, to the overwhelmed and not around and probably mental health and substance abuse challenged mother, to the father that they've never met, and to the gangs. We send them back to the gangs who had no contact with them while they were with us, who gave them no support throughout their court journey or their rehabilitation journey, but certainly are there the day they get out. And for so many of our kids, the temptation, no matter how much we poured into them in the time we had them out of the community, just the temptation and being stuck in that life that brought them to us is too great for them to overcome. I know of 3 of my boys right now who are completed Central Oklahoma Juvenile Center in Oklahoma County jail as adults with new charges, and that just, I'm not doing well about it. And I think of what we did wrong, and I think part of it was we didn't give them a solid enough community plan. What we've identified for a lot of our kids coming out is that independent living would be the best thing for them, or some kind of, independent living space, or, a 17-year-old with no credit history and a criminal history doesn't really qualify for a lot of apartments anywhere. Not a lot of people willing to take that risk on a 17-year-old. And so we had an RFP out, and we're hoping to start some contracted independent living soon, but there can never be enough. Kids want to have their own place. I talked to a kid on Wednesday at Kojak. He is in DHS custody, permanent DHS custody. He's also in OJ custody, is what we call dual custody. And he's about to be 18 in December. And I said, "What are your plans?" He goes, "Oh, I'm going to Entrada in El Reno," because when he was in El Reno at the youth service children's shelter there as a DHS kid, they took him over to this independent living program they have in El Reno. And he said, I walked in and this boy said, "Hey, you want to see my room?" And he said, "You should have seen his room." And I've seen those rooms. They're the tiniest little studio apartments with just like one room, and you could probably, spread your hands and touch all the walls. And it's got a little teeny sink and a little teeny hot plate and a mini fridge, but it's got its own bed and a little bathroom, and it's a program where they have they have both these young independent living kids, and then they have kind of a older retirement kind of population, and they build a community and work together and kind of mentor and look out for each other. And the kid will help drive the car of the older person to go to the grocery shopping, and they'll go grocery shopping together, and they'll compare what their needs are, and maybe they'll have a meal together. And so he's very excited about that. But there are not enough beds there, and there are not enough places. That there's such a need for so many young people, not even involved in the juvenile justice system, to have opportunities for housing independent of their families, and to begin their life on their own. That there's just not enough, and certainly our juvenile justice kids are not always the best candidate, the ones that people are like, yes, I want him with his criminal record.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I want to leave just a few minutes for questions. John, are you going to help us with the mic on that? Do you mind? Or somebody? Okay. Oh, we got somebody. So if you have questions, I do want to touch on just a bit about, while we're getting the mic over to Jim, I do want to touch just a minute on gangs, because we're not LA, right? And you think, oh, it doesn't, there's some, but there's not that much here. And you don't really hear about gangs much here. It's not in the news a whole lot. It's not something that's really even, anti-gangs is not preached in school or, anything like that. What are you seeing?
A lot of gangs, especially the boys at our highest level, of course, especially from Oklahoma and Tulsa area, are highly involved in gang activity, either because that's what their whole family, including their mother and father, are in, or the gang did what the gang does and identified that kid that didn't have proper supervision or guidance, and said, "We'll give that to you." Oh, not proper in any way, but we'll give you something to do. We'll give you a family to love you. The kids at the highest levels, one of the big issues, and there have been articles on this, is guns. My kids tell me that it is easier for them to get a gun than it is for them to get alcohol. And that even though once they're adjudicated as a delinquent, they're prohibited from possessing a gun, being in a home where there's a gun, being in a car where there's a gun for 10 years from that adjudication. For me and you, it would be like, I mean, I forgot my wedding band today, and I'm kind of like feeling that. Don't start rumors about, about the state of my marriage, but like, I feel that emptiness without having it. Our teenagers in Oklahoma, Tulsa, Lawton, and the ones that are gang involved would feel naked and unsafe without a gun on them, because everybody has a gun. I had a kid in their life. I had a kid lament to me, "I just miss fist fights. I just wish we could do fist fights." Because if you get in a fight, you have to bring a gun because your opponent will have a gun. Guns are so easy for them to get. One thing I'd ask you to do is lock your car doors. Just lock your car doors. And if you have a gun, just bring it in your house and lock that as well. Because our kids are just getting guns from unlocked cars. I mean, that's how easy it is for them to get a gun. Then once that gun is on the streets, it can have many crimes and many bodies on it, and just continue to get passed around. And a lot of my kids that are, the vast majority at the highest level, are shooters. They've shot at people. Some have killed people, and having access to that gun is what allowed them to be that. What would have been a fist fight, but they had a gun, so they used the gun and shot it. Now, fortunately, these guns are usually in bad condition and they're terrible shooters, so we don't have as many murders as we probably should, because they're like, just like not shooting properly because they don't have the training. But the guns are bad, the gangs are bad in Oklahoma County, in Tulsa County, and Lawton. And we have kids that, while they're with us, lose family members, cousins, brothers, to gun violence. And it very much affects them. We're not as much aware of it, but our boys grieve these losses that they have while they're with us. And I say to them, if you weren't here, would you have probably been there when this happened? And they said yes. And I said, would you have likely felt you needed to do something from this happening? And they said yes. And I say, well, think about why you're here and what that means and what you should do with that chance.
Question, Jim?
I read that story this morning in the paper. It led off with an Edmond kid, got in a fight, got arrested, sent to court, ended up with an $800, it's like a 16-year-old, $800 fine in probation. Probably his parents are going to have to pay for it. And then later in the story, that somebody described it, this whole court thing, as the school to prison pipeline. So what are your thoughts on how should schools handle when there's a fight or something like that, instead of arresting them and sending them to court? Or what's the alternatives?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, and I think it said in that article, wouldn't it be great if we could, we want people to be safe, right? We don't want there to be fights in school. We want there to be safety, and certainly if you're fighting in school or fighting anywhere, there should be some kind of consequence. And that includes, I think, that kid was also suspended from school, so I think the article was he thought that was the punishment, school suspension, this extra criminal layer. The article pointed to, if we had more counselors, if we had more nurses, just more even adults trained in mediation, right? If we could have sat those two boys down and mediated it and tried to, which is what we try to do at our facility, and try to work through what caused this conflict and how do we stop this conflict. It'll have much better outcomes and do much better for that kid than making him feel he's a criminal. And he talked about now he doesn't trust the criminal justice system because of that what happened to him.
There's a school in Tulsa, and you'll know the name, I'm sure. I went and visited it, but they do a really good job. They're right in the heart of the urban area, and they do a really good job because they focus on these kids, and they know their kids, and they know their families. So if Johnny doesn't come to school, they go home. They go to the home, and they find Johnny and they see what's going on with Johnny. And they try to intercept issues before they become an issue, right? Because it could be that nobody was at home to wake Johnny up, or it could be that Johnny hasn't eaten all weekend and he couldn't get himself up. Those are easy fixes, right? But if it's 2 weeks that Johnny hasn't come to school and nobody's noticed, we got a much bigger issue going on there. So that's this kind of I'm not going to use the right word, like an experimental school. They're working on trying these new concepts of, but they're heavily staffed enough to be able to do that. So that's another thing. We've got to have better staffing in our schools, whether it be volunteers that do this, or more counselors, more teachers, that type of thing. We're out of time, but thank you so much, Rachel, for your time
Thank you
today.
all. Thank you.